There is nothing in life I love more than international rugby league. And while that is a sad indictment on how interesting the rest of my life is, it's a badge that I wear with pride. While for many, the NRL Grand Final represents the bittersweet ending of the main event, to me it signals the start of what is the best time of the year. But while the general discourse around international season talks about the best 17s that these teams could name, something that I did myself in one of my most viewed videos ever last year, I do find myself approaching this end of the season with a little bit of pessimism, in waiting for the inevitability of seeing some of the best players in those potential 17s drop out for one reason or another. As brilliant as the growth of the international game has been over the course of the last decade, I firmly believe that it's unfortunately been stunted, that the international game could have quite easily been in a much better place, so much so that I think there's a whole other nation that could have joined the elite category alongside Tonga and Samoa. I was in two minds about making this video because this is the time of year where international rugby league should be celebrated, not criticized, but this is something that I need to get off my chest. So without further ado, let's get into it. Here's a fact about representative rugby league in Australia. Players come through the grades with the hope and ambition of getting a contract with an NRL club. Based on the performances that they put in at the NRL level, the State of Origin selectors pick the best of the best for that arena. Now, traditionally, Origin was considered to be a selection trial for the Australian Kangaroos at the end of the season. The pipeline of talent was from first grade through to Origin, through to the Kangaroos. Instead, the practical hierarchy of the way the game is structured in Australia has Origin at the pinnacle, the NRL as a close second, and a Kangaroos jersey at a distant third. I have no doubt that Aussie players consider it an absolute honour to play for their country, but the rep sides that they dream of playing for are New South Wales and Queensland. If you gave any Australian player the decision of never playing for the Kangaroos again, or never playing Origin again, I don't think many of them would struggle to make that call. Given that Australia hosts and drives the culture of rugby league in the Southern Hemisphere, that means that the international game at large is put on the back burner, reduced to an afterthought. The international game is to rugby league what the PS section is to a letter, and that is a mentality that I believe is firmly at odds with the best interests of the future of our sport. I've said many a time on this channel, rugby league is the best sport in the world, and I believe that it has tremendous international potential. But to sell anything to a customer who isn't familiar with you, you need to provide a connection that they recognize, something that they can latch onto to pique their interest. Now, you're never going to achieve that with Canterbury Bankstown, Manly Warringah, St George Illawarra, Cronulla Sutherland, Parramatta, etc. You're also never going to achieve that with Wigan, St Helens, Leigh, Wakefield, etc. On an international scale, and even to an extent within those countries, those place names might as well be made up. Now, that said, I do think you could do it with Melbourne, Brisbane, Sydney, London, Leeds, etc., but that's a different story for a different day. One connection you could absolutely provide new fans with is the fact that they know Australia, England, New Zealand, Samoa, Fiji, even aspirationally the likes of France, Serbia, and the Netherlands. People know what those things are. They know the cultures that those places represent, and so without even having watched a game of rugby league, they already have a little something that interests them in seeing two countries, two cultures come together. There is an appeal in the clash between the two countries. Let me ask you, what are the two biggest sporting events worldwide, where no matter who you are, or where you are, or your interest level in sport, you and the rest of the world stop and watch? The two answers, by a margin, are the Olympic Games and the FIFA World Cup. And that proves my point. You, and I'm talking to you specifically, you could not care less about javelin throwing or shot put or even really running races. But when it's the Olympics and you get to see your country or other countries come up against each other, you watch a sport that you have absolutely zero interest in because it's not the sport that provides the appeal. That's largely the reason why I believe that the international game is rugby league's strongest tool in terms of global growth. It's the key to our future, but unfortunately our own attitudes and our own behavior would suggest that we think otherwise. It's a tale as old as time, players pulling out towards the start of an international window. And while many do so as a result of genuine injury, there are two major causes given that I see happen a lot more often than I would like. The first, and to me the most egregious, is pulling out in order to focus on preseason. For all the reasons that I just went into, it is vastly more important for rugby league to have the best players playing in the international fixtures rather than to have those players be 10% better for the start of the NRL season. Keep in mind, the decision isn't between playing the internationals or having a preseason. Every single one of these players on the wall behind me is going to have a preseason. It's just going to be pushed back a bit. From a big picture perspective, that is nowhere near a worthy sacrifice for the game of rugby league. The second, and this is one that I have a lot more sympathy for, but it is still frustrating, is players who pull out to have post-season surgery. Now, this is a tougher case to argue because if you need surgery, you need surgery. And I sure as hell personally wouldn't have the toughness to play a game of rugby league through an injury. I barely have the toughness to play rugby league when fit. But what frustrates me so much about the post-season surgery excuse is that it isn't the postseason. The rugby league season is still going. The fact that we use that term without thinking twice speaks volumes about the regard in which the international game is still kept. The mentality with which we approach it. I'll go through more examples in a second, but take a guy like Jahrome Hughes, who has now pulled out of the Kiwi squad for the second year in a row. He played in the prelim final and the grand final, and yet you're asking me to believe that he is not fit to play in games starting 2 weeks after the grand final and needs surgery now. You tell me, with a straight face, that if the Melbourne Storm were playing this weekend instead of the New Zealand Kiwis, Jahrome Hughes wouldn't be playing. The club side being deemed more important than the international side. Now, on that note, and this is the most interesting part of this video, I sat down and did a deep dive into the teams that have been named for the Pacific Championships, with more of a focus on the players who weren't there than the players who were. I then did research into the injury news around those players and put a line through all the ones that are genuinely not fit to play in the Pacific Championships through injury. Unfortunately, using only players that by all accounts should be match fit for the Pacific Championships but aren't there, I can field almost a full 17, which if it had 2 extra players, I genuinely think would be good enough to win the entire Pacific Championships. To go through it, Suafa Alongo suffered a hamstring injury that should put him out for, quote, 8 to 12 weeks 15 weeks ago. He was named in the extended squads for Melbourne in the final series, but won't be playing the Pacific Championships. Michaeli Ravalawa has no record of injury or surgery. Siosifa Talakai also has no record of injury or surgery. Stephen Crichton, though he did miss the end of the season for the Bulldogs, was initially named to play in their final game against Penrith, a game which took place 4 weeks before Samoa's first game in the Pacific Championships. You're telling me that in 4 weeks he got less fit to play? His Bulldogs teammate Marcelo Montoya also missed that game against Penrith, but was described as hopeful of playing in that game and is listed as returning for the Pacific Championships. He's not named in the Fiji squad though. Jahrome Hughes, according to the Storm, has been sidelined for the Pacific Championships because he requires surgery on his shoulder. Again, if you need surgery, you need surgery, but evidently he didn't need it in order to play for Melbourne. Spencer Leniu has no record of injury or surgery. Api Coruscant has no record of injury or surgery. Regan Campbell-Gillard has no record of injury or surgery. Viliami Kickout is an interesting one because he did fracture his eye socket, though he played through the pain. The NRL physio says that that is an injury that takes 3 to 5 weeks to heal, but Fiji's first game marks 6 weeks since the fracture. Bio reports he has recovered from that fracture, but isn't playing in the Pacific Championships because he's getting married during them. Now, all the best to him. I wish nothing but happiness for the new bride and groom, but the fact is you wouldn't see him pull out of a Bulldogs game because he's getting married. You wouldn't see a State of Origin player pull out of Origin because they're getting married. You wouldn't steal a car because you're getting married. You wouldn't steal a handbag because you're getting married. I understand that personal circumstances are what they are, but it's yet another instance where the international game loses out. Sean Bloor did have injuries towards the back end of the season, but recovered in time for the prelim and the grand final and has no record of being currently injured. Leo Thompson has no record of injury or surgery. Jacob Saifiti has no record of injury or surgery. And both Samuela and Sione Fainu both publicly pledged their allegiance to Fiji only a couple of weeks ago, and there is no stated reason as to why they're not in the squad. And to show the damage that can cause, let me refocus back on Api Coruscant. He turns 33 next month. He hasn't got many years left in his career. And despite having represented Fiji 17 times, this will now be the 3rd year in a row where he hasn't played for his country. Now, in fairness, that was due to being suspended last year, but this year, there hasn't been any reason given. That means that instead of having one of the premier dummy halves in the competition, a man who would captain the side and in many ways drive their playing culture, Fiji Bati have instead named Penioni Tangituimua, a 26-year-old who plays Ron Massey Cup. Cup. And I really don't want to sound dismissive of Tangi Tuimua. I genuinely hope he kills it, but I think he'd be the first to admit that he is a long way off Api Coruscant. And I want to go back to this graphic that I showed because unfortunately for Fiji, there is a hell of a lot of sky blue in that lineup. If those players elected to play in the Pacific Championships, the team that they would field for this weekend looks like this. That is a side. That is a team that could genuinely be competitive against the likes of Tonga and Samoa. A side who, like we so often said about Tonga and Samoa themselves back in the day, is probably about one genuinely elite halfback away from being one of the top international sides. And it makes perfect sense. The population of Fiji is over 3 times as big as the populations of Tonga and Samoa combined. This is the sleeping giant of International Rugby League. Instead, the side that they've actually named on the weekend looks like this. It just sucks, man. Like, there's no two ways about it. They've had to call in Michael Jennings from Ron Massey Cup. That man is literally 200 years old. On a serious note though, the year that Michael Jennings turned 30, Cooper Cronk and James Tedesco moved to the Sydney Roosters, Brian To'o was still over a year away from making his first grade debut, and Reece Walsh was 15 years old. All that is to say, don't tell me that we're watching the Fijian national team this weekend, because we're not. And what does that do? It reinforces the notion that the international game is substandard, lowering the regard in which it is held by rugby league fans and increasing the likelihood that players pull out in the future. I want to make one thing very clear though. I don't actually think I blame the players for this. I don't doubt that someone like Api Coruscant is passionate about Fiji and would love to represent them if he could. I think I actually blame the NRL clubs because, and there's evidence for this, they are putting pressure on their players not to play representative fixtures. One example that stands out to me concerns my own club, the Sydney Roosters. I remember the year that we signed Brandon Smith, a former Dally M hooker of the year. He spoke about how in the preseason, Trent Robertson sat him down and they came to the mutual agreement that it would be better off if he didn't play for the Māori All-Stars and instead spent that week of preseason with the Roosters. This left the Māori All-Stars with no option but to select 27-year-old back rower Kori Harawira Naira at hooker. It was the only time in his 212 career appearances that he ever played that position. We had to watch that, and the game suffered as a result for the slight incremental increase in performance that Brandon Smith got by spending that week at the Roosters instead of spending it with the Māori All-Stars. To see a guy like Trent Robertson cause that, when I consider him to be probably the most internationally minded coach in the game, it really disappointed me. And it applies just the same way when clubs ask players to pull out of internationals at the back end of the season so that they can focus on preseason. You try being a player in that situation and telling your coach and your employer, the club, no, actually, I'm not going to do what you want me to do. I'm going to go risk injury by playing for my international side instead. And why wouldn't the club put those pressures on? I mean, they're directly incentivized to. The clubs who release players to play international fixtures are at a direct disadvantage relative to the clubs who don't. And it's actually funny because in theory, that is a force that should equalize the competition. The top clubs have the most rep players, and so their players not getting complete preseason should be a force that makes the competition more even. Instead, when those top guys withdraw, you get instances like Bradman Best this season who'll jump at a Kangaroos jersey because he knows that it's much harder to get picked from Newcastle than it is from most other teams. Xavier Coates ends up back at the Storm for a full preseason and Bradman Best only gets a partial one at the Knights. Funny how that works out. Look, I hate being critical of rugby league because I've spent so much of my life defending it. But when you're relying on the selflessness and goodwill of clubs in order to have a functioning international game, something has gone fundamentally wrong. I said at the start of this video that while the international game is growing, its growth has been stunted, and I hope these ramblings have explained why. And I do want to say, please don't let this dissuade you from watching this year's international fixtures. I'm going to be watching them. I'm going to be streaming them. I mean, we don't get a better international game by ignoring the international game that we currently have. The cultural shift will come via the number of people who watch it, but we could be doing a lot better, and I do have faith that one day soon, we will. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.